Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this session of the Growth Lab Development Talks. I am Karen Donfried. I'm a senior fellow at the Belfer Center here at the Harvard Kennedy School. And prior to that, I'm the Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and Eurasia. So I have long been a fan of Moldova, and it is such an extraordinary pleasure to be moderating this conversation with Natalia Gavrilița. She is Moldova's former prime minister, and this is for a conversation about leading change and navigating crisis, something which, for better or for worse, you honed your skills on. I had the privilege of watching Natalia when she was prime minister. And if you want an example of bravery and resilience, it surely is Moldova. It is arguably the most vulnerable country in Europe today. It has to fend off Russian malign influence and also is a neighbor to Ukraine. So they have been directly impacted by Russia's war against Ukraine. And Natalia was prime minister. She was part of a very dynamic duo with Moldova's president, Maia Sandu. And I just found both of them inspiring in their leadership. What we're going to do is I'm going to give Natalia the opportunity to set the stage with some brief comments. Then I have a few questions for her, and then I'm going to open it up to all of you. So please be thinking about what questions you want to ask her as she's speaking. So again, great to have you here. Over to you.
It's great to be back at the Kennedy School, and it's great to have this event. I'm very excited about your interest, and to have such a knowledgeable person moderate this discussion. Karen knows the region and the context very well. Also, I have to be very careful what I say, because Professor Hausman is here, and I have to show that I've taken all the great lessons from my class with him back to managing the crisis and implementing structural reforms in Moldova. And also, by surprise, Lucio Vinas de Souza is here, who right after Kennedy School, I worked with at DG ECFIN at the European Commission. And we wrote a couple of interesting papers on quasi-fiscal activities in Moldova and the trade flows with Russia. We'll touch upon in my presentation. I want to start by sort of you imagining what it's like a prime country that is neighboring Ukraine on the 24th of February. We had, we read the intelligence, saw the news. There was this debate, will there be a war or not? And we did all the contingency planning that we could, but ultimately, we really didn't think that such a terrible aggression and a large-scale war can happen right in our neighborhood. And we had a lot of reasons to be very worried. First of all, we share 1,200 kilometers of border with Ukraine, 1/3 of which is with a separatist Transnistrian region, which the central authorities do not control. This separatist region has Russian troops on its territory that supposedly are guarding some 20,000 tons of munitions that were left from the Soviet Union in a village bordering Ukraine. Also, majority of the people in Moldova believe in neutrality. For 30 years, neutrality was seen as a way to convince the Russian authorities to withdraw Russian troops from Moldova. And this has been talked about so much that we didn't have any security umbrella. We didn't think about investing in our security and military because it was frowned upon by Russia. And then we touted neutrality as sort of a solution to getting the Russian troops out. At the same time, this war had the potential to bring a large humanitarian crisis because the easternmost, border crossing point with Ukraine is only 60 meters away from Odessa. And the region of Odessa has a population of 2.3 million people, so just the region. And the whole of Moldova has a population of 2.6 million people. Later, when I visited border crossing points and interacted with refugees, I've even met people who walked from Odessa to the border with Moldova. And then also, Moldova is quite a poor country. Our GDP per capita is $5,230 US, and we were already grappling with the consequences of the pandemic, an energy blackmail that Russia put us through in the autumn of 21, and rising inflation. So all of this together, we were facing sort of a potential of a military incursion, humanitarian crisis, coupled with all the problems that we already were facing. And politically, the government had been in power only 6 months, and the last parliamentary elections that Moldova had were actually quite remarkable and extraordinary. After years of sort of not having a purpose and being ruled by various oligarchs and pro-Russian forces, and after a massive banking fraud that we saw in 2014, after 12% of GDP was siphoned off through state. So we saw this wave of people voting for rule of law and justice reform, anti-corruption, structural reforms, fair competition. And so expectations were very, very high that what the government would do is actually quickly transform Moldova into a sort of developed European state. So what we did was actually implement everything that we sort of prepared for. So I think what is extraordinary in how sort of the people in Moldova mobilized is that we managed to deal with the crisis in the way that changed Moldova's reputation. And at the same time, we very much moved forward with the structural reforms that people voted us for. So just to give you a couple of sort of outcome indicators, we ultimately received 5 times more refugees than UNHCR thought our total capability to be. I think some over 600,000 people crossed through Moldova, and at the highest point we housed 125,000 refugees. And for a country as small as Moldova, this was the highest per capita figure out of any European country. At the same time, we supported Ukraine in other ways that we could. So we are very strong on solidarity lanes. We did all this work together with the Romanian government to improve logistics. So we opened a floating new bridge. You know, no new bridge with Romania has been in works for 30 years. And we, in just several months, built the infrastructure leading to the river and build a floating bridge on the river to ease some of these logistics constraints. We, in 1 year, diversified our 100% dependency on Gazprom for gas provision in the right bank Moldova, so what is under the control of the central government, to 0 gas from Gazprom. So we bought everything on the international markets, even though everybody knows prices went crazy. I think nobody expected Moldova to be the first country to use the Greece-Bulgaria interconnector, or the first country to use the Trans-Balkan pipeline in reverse, with sort of all the, not only with sort of the ability to go to the markets, but all the governance arrangements that means, and all the contacts that you need to make in order to make it happen. We also implemented structural reforms at the same time. In 2022, we were the highest performer on Media Freedom Index. We also improved our transparency international indicators to reach a 10-year high. So corruption went down, particularly in state-owned enterprises and other areas like customs, fiscal authority, and so on. We also started an external evaluation of judges and prosecutors together with international partners and started sort of a very comprehensive justice reform and improved our standing on rule of law indices. And of course, this all came at a price. So we had quite profound stagflation. The economy contracted by 6% in 2022 and a further 2.5% in the first semester of this year. Inflation at its highest in 2022 was 34%. It's still over 10% now. We saw the standards of living falling. The tariffs for gas increased 7 times for the population. This means that an average Moldovan household spend 15% of their income on energy bills, compared to less than 5% in European countries. And last year, this figure went up to as high as 43%. So 43% of the incomes of an average household went to pay gas bills and electricity bills. So what we did, we also introduced very quickly a targeted energy vulnerability program, which provided cash transfers to the most vulnerable population and reduced some of this costs for the households. But of course, ultimately, we also paid politically, and the government that I led had to resign in order to provide an opportunity for continuing further reforms and giving some optimism to the people that things can go better. Last thing I want to say before we open it up to questions is that I'm very proud of Moldova as an example of women's leadership. I think traditionally we see sort of some of these security military jobs or crisis management in more traditional light. And I think that what we've demonstrated is that women can manage such situations just as well. I want to add that besides the president being a woman and the prime minister being a woman, and I think during that time we were the only country in the world that had sort of both positions filled by women. We also had the Minister of Internal Affairs, a woman, and that ministry basically handled the brunt of the refugee crisis, but also the sort of border management and security issues. We also, at that time, had a head of the Constitutional Court who was a woman, and the anti-corruption prosecutor. And this is also due to the policies we've implemented. So we've introduced double quota in parliament, for example, and 40% of our members of parliament are women. And in these elections we have local elections coming up in November. We are taking this quota to the local level as well. We've also introduced a number of policies to make it easier for women to participate in such responsible positions by making more flexible sort of parental leave, rules around daycares, and so on and so forth. So I'm very proud to say that sort of the entire society mobilized in a way that completely changed Moldova's reputation. And then from a country, that was only in the news due to some, outstanding corruption crisis, we turned sort of the reputation of Moldova as a small country with a big heart, who in the midst of a war in neighboring Ukraine managed to support the Ukrainians, support the refugees, support solidarity lanes and food security in the entire world, and at the same time transform the country in a way that was worthy of becoming candidates to the European Union, which was ultimately our biggest promise to our people when we went into elections. We said that by 2024, in the 4 years of the mandate, we would apply for candidate status to the European Union. So when we started, we didn't even think we could apply until 2024. But the way that this worked out is that we not only applied, but also became candidate, and we are very positive that in a month or two, there will also be a decision of the European Union negotiations with Moldova going forward. So I will close by saying, watch this space, a newcomer to the European Union, and come visit Moldova, research Moldova. When I was here, very few people knew about Moldova. I kept talking about it in all my classes, so my friends nicknamed me Moldova. But I think now I think now there is a growing number of people who could have that nickname. So that is a very positive development. Thank you.
Well, you've made it clear why the Moldovan story is so remarkable. You've also made it clear the challenges you face. And the statistics you rolled out about stagflation, about economic contraction, standards of living falling, high energy costs, these are challenges that are still with Moldova. And I'm curious what you see as the recipe that leads Moldova to restore economic growth. And this will be part of your new position as well. But just what did you learn in Professor Hausman's class that you can that can lead Moldova back?
Well, the main thing I learned is that we need to be humble about the recipes for growth, and we also need to understand very well the context and sort of take decisions based on the context. And it's actually very hard because Moldova is a small country. It's very small and open economy. It's very much influenced by what is happening in the region. It also has the problems that many Eastern European countries have, and that is a deficit of people. We have very high out-migration and low fertility rates. So the population of Moldova is shrinking very rapidly. So we have to think, like, what is the response to that? And, even if we want to attract a competent labor force from abroad, actually, when there's a war in the vicinity, not many people want to come. So we have to think about, our labor force and where do we direct the scarce resource? So what type of sectors we want to develop and why? We were talking about industrial policy coming back in the US and Europe. So I think we need to do some sort of fresh analysis and see, well, under these circumstances, what is our offer to investors, to our development partners? What is our role in the region? What is our role in a future reconstruction of Ukraine? What do we need to do to sort of improve our capabilities, our infrastructure, to be an active participant in these developments? And at the same time, I mean, we have to do what we've done. We know that we need more capital, we need higher productivity, but without proper rule of law, that's actually very difficult to achieve. So we need to continue with justice reform, with governance reforms, to improve our institutions, to improve our service, improve the expectations of our people, because ultimately, it's this economic or differences in wages and then this outlook and expectations that drive our people, and especially the most talented people, out of Moldova. So it's very challenging. Again, I've met with investors who are saying, oh, we've waited for someone like you to come to power in Moldova so long, but we're going to wait until the war is over and then make our decision about investment. So, we have to think, and we have been thinking with our partners, for example, what guarantee instruments like, guarantee for political risk or currency risk that would help some investors to make the leap and come to Moldova even before the war is over. So there is a number of things that we need to do, and I think that we are trying our hardest to do it. I'm working on a new economic think tank in Moldova to work on some of these solutions to the more strategic issues that governments sometimes don't have the time or the capability to think about because of low state capability, which you probably all know about.
Thanks so much. You have shared with me that along with this challenge of economic growth, the other big challenge for Moldova as it seeks to stay on this pro-EU path that your government and President Sandu ushered in is the challenge of Russian malign influence. You have a very large country that is actively seeking to destabilize your country. How do you fight back against that?
So even though we are not involved in the military conflict, we definitely have a hybrid war with Russia. So in the beginning of the war, in some of the meetings, I would even say, look, Russia doesn't have to spend money on a missile, to attack Moldova, because it can attack through hybrid means and destabilize the country to the point where it doesn't need missiles. So we have seen a ramping up of these hybrid war elements, like cyber attacks, for example. We've had more than 200 cyber attacks in 2022, including in August of 2022, the biggest attack in the history of Moldova. And I'm glad to say that through a number of techniques, we were able to withstand that attack, even though its magnitude sort of was higher than our capacity. I'm not an IT specialist, I can't tell you all the details, but it was quite a nervous 2-3 days, including because we had attacks from within. So we've had our own authorities. We had sort of servers that were taken over, and there were attacks from within. So we managed to stop some of that in time to not do the damage. At the same time, we had, in 2022, more than 300 bomb alerts. So pretty much every day, we saw bomb alerts to the airport in particular, and the court systems. So the airport, so for example, I will tell you, I was going on a official visit to Romania, and they called in and said there's a bomb right around the time that my flight was supposed to leave. And then 4 hours later, the foreign minister was supposed to leave on another flight. There was a bomb alert again. So in 2 days, do you think that was a coincidence that it was like bomb alerts right when we were supposed to leave? But that disrupted a lot, sort of, this is this feeling of insecurity that people have, like they hear about bomb alerts every day. And then most importantly, we have an extraordinary amount of disinformation and fake news and half-truths. And so we had a lot of influence. So Moldova still has about 30% of Russian-speaking population. These are not just Russians. These are Ukrainians, Bulgarians, a minority, a Turkic minority called Gagauz, and even some Moldovans. Like historically, they've been following more sort of the Russian language news. And we closed 6 TV stations, the same TV stations that European Union closed. So these were Russian retransmitted channels. But then we saw everybody move to online. And now the internet is like 70% use it as one of the 3 top news providers. Telegram is massively popular in Moldova, and people believe in what they read there. And sometimes I would read things about sort of my fellow members of the party, like members of parliament. And I would actually have to take the time and go and ask them, because some of these half-truths are just so difficult to disentangle, even if you have massive amounts of information and critical thinking. Now think about people who, are Russian-speaking and maybe poorly educated. This changes a lot their attitudes and their perception of the reality. So it's very difficult to think of solutions to these problems. Right now, before the local elections, we're seeing massive amounts of cash going to through one of these pro-Russian parties from a fugitive or led by a fugitive oligarch who is not in Moldova, but still manages to disrupt the politics in Moldova. So this is why when yesterday some students asked me what is the most important element of keeping us to the pro-European path, and I said it's actually combating disinformation. It's investing into good content. It's investing in education and critical thinking. I mean, this is more long-term, but investing in free media and sort of helping our societies. I think liberal democracy is under attack everywhere, and we do need good content to be able to maintain our countries on this path.
Terrific. I have so many more questions to ask, but I know all of you do as well. So I want to come to those of you in the audience. Who wants to jump in? Please. The mic.
Thank you so much, Prime Minister, for your time today. In 2018, I visited Moldova. I researched Moldova. It's a beautiful country, and I really echo your call. Everyone should do that too.
Wine.
And they have fantastic wine, indeed, among many other things. My research had a lot to do with the situation in Transnistria. Back in 2018, there was some hope that the negotiations were moving forward. The situation has changed a lot now. So I was wondering if you could share your thoughts on, in the context of Moldova nowadays, with the EU giving candidate status on one hand, and Russia behaving so aggressively in the neighborhood on the other hand, what can Moldova do, and how can Moldova be supported to bring Transnistria back? Thank you.
Thank you for this question. So counterintuitively, I actually think there is more hope now than in 2018. So one important thing that happened after the war started is that the border between Moldova and Ukraine on the Transnistrian perimeter was closed. So this means that this big hole that was sucking out resources through contraband and smuggling and the illicit activity now is closed. Like all goods from the Transnistrian region, which has historically a better developed industry than the right bank Moldova, because it's separated by a river for those who don't know. But yeah, so now all goods go through Moldovan border crossings, and all of a sudden we have more leverage. Companies have had to register. It means they have to comply to Moldovan legislation. We have seen that the only way that the Transnistrian can sell the electricity that they produce is to Moldova. And with the expiration of the gas transit agreement between Russia and Ukraine, there is a real question, well, where are they going to get the gas from? And then, what will the price of gas means for the competitiveness of their production of electricity or the metal processing industry or the cement industry and so on. So the real question is what happens to the 1,500 troops that are stationed on the territory of Moldova? And then, how do we integrate the region in a way that doesn't disrupt the advances that Moldova has made? So we had a positive signal from the EU that we could move forward with the EU integration process, even if we have a frozen conflict. But we want to integrate these people, and they all have Moldovan passports. So actually, they could come and vote and participate in the political process. So I think that sort of managing that and a transition period where they are exposed to at least some alternative news, because for 30 years they've only had Russian propaganda. And I was giving this example recently that my family comes from the Transnistrian region, and sometimes my aunts and uncles believe what they read in the Russian newspapers rather than me. So that tells you how strong that propaganda is. So we need to analyze the data that we're getting from this significant change in circumstances. We need to think about our leverage and negotiate in terms of sort of the new economic distribution, and we need to think what is the type of transition towards democratization that would allow us to integrate the Transnistrian region without disbalancing the rest of Moldova.
Many thanks. One of the pieces that we actually wrote all those years ago was what we strictly called the Costs of No-Moldova, which was a sort of a blueprint on how we could integrate Transnistria into the border economic body of Moldova. But that's not my point. The point that I would like to try to make is the following. Once you enter the European Union is not something that necessarily yields what you want to get in the end of the day. There's no guarantee of convergence as we use on the European balance, but provides you some tools for convergence for your country. I come from a country that actually has failed to converge in the past 3 years, so we didn't use the opportunities the European Union integration offered to us. From a point of view of your own strategic thinking about what's going to be the niche that Moldova is going to aim for once in the European Union, what are the usage that you are going to have for the resources that will come once you become a pre-accession country, because this unlocks an envelope of resources for you. Is there any strategic thinking in terms of how you are going to use this opportunity, and what is the niche that you want to have as an economy and as a country on the broader structure of the Union? It's not only a question for Moldova, but for the other countries, especially for Ukraine, once we actually start with the process. So if there is a strategic thinking, I would like to try to understand from you what it is. And if it's not, I would urge you to start doing this test.
Thank you. This is actually the million-dollar question. And this is why we're trying to bring the Growth Lab to Moldova to do some analysis and help us come up with this sort of strategic niche. I mean, again, I said there is changing context, and actually it's very difficult to analyze what is that niche given the changing context. And I'll give you some examples. So Moldova is currently a big agricultural producer. I mean, it's only 10% of GDP now. It used to be much more, but it employs a lot of people. So we could start doing more in processing, but then who are we competing with? What are the logistics costs and so on? So these are very good questions. But other sectors, pharmaceuticals, for example, we have a very good medical university with good value for money, and therefore it's popular even with international students. And we also have some pharmaceutical companies that, some of them are Romanian companies that have European certification. A lot of structural reforms in regulations in the last 2 years in the pharmaceutical sectors. It has gone very much under the radar. But and we've become all of a sudden competitive for some products because logistics are so expensive with China. But do we know what's going to happen in 2-3 years? Is China going to become competitive again? Or we could invest in infrastructure and, expand our logistics routes and create sort of some of these logistics centers. But then now there is a lot of demand because the Odessa port is closed. What happens when the Odessa port reopens? Will that flop all of a sudden and all this investment will be or poorly spent? So, industrial policy in the past had a bad name because, it was sort of accepted in the literature that governments are very bad at making these bets, and they cannot come up with sort of the right industry to support or the right, and it's a hit or miss. Luckily now we have better frameworks, but still these are not trivial questions and should be thought through very well. And you also need to have a political process where this is understood beyond the lifetime of a government, which in Moldova on average lasts a year. So, these are the type of issues, precisely the type of issues that we should think of in the process of European integration, because it will affect the sequencing of adjustment to some of the regulations of the European Union.
Super, thanks. Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here. My name is Lucas. I'm in the MPP program, and before I worked in the European Parliament. And my question is about EU accession, and I'm curious to learn, what do Moldovans expect from the accession process? Because we all know that the Western Balkan countries, they've been in this process for years, sometimes for centuries, and lately there haven't been so many steps forward. So really my question is, what do you and what do Moldovans expect from this status as candidate country?
So I think what I expect and what Moldovans expect is a bit different. So what I expect is an impetus for the true transformation of Moldova. I mean, we have seen from the European integration process that this is a process that, if used wisely, can provide the political support to do some of these very difficult transformations. So I think, the process itself is just as valuable as the ultimate prize of becoming member of the European Union. In fact, we have seen from some countries that once you get that prize, it becomes difficult again to stay on the path of transformation, particularly in the rule of law and justice sector. So to me, the next several years are crucial because, we make it or not by 2030 as our objective is, we can actually, as part of this process, deeply transform Moldova in a way that will bring it to a new equilibrium. What people expect is peace and prosperity. And I think that's what people expect everywhere. And yes, people want that quickly. And, we need to work with people to help them along the way, to help them understand and have the right expectations about what type of sacrifices do we need to do in the short term to achieve those objectives in the medium and long term. And even then, it's a fast-changing world, and sometimes we may not get there. So I think this is very natural, and I think all politicians and all economists and technical people should understand this and then work with these expectations.
I like it. It's about the journey, not just the destination. Okay, let's come to this side of the room for a change. And I see someone in the back too.
Thank you. Thank you for visiting us. My name is Clément. I work at the Growth Lab, and I'm actually very interested in the Moldovan case. In a way, I'm asking a related question. I wanted to hear your views on the EU, but from a people's perspective. You have a 2.6 million population, as you mentioned. I believe at this point, for sure, more than 8 million of those hold Romanian citizenship. So technically, there are EU citizens as well, even though many of them still live in Moldova. I'm sure that presents, it's a very original situation, I believe, to be in on that scale. I'm wondering how you think about the challenges that this creates for the country and the opportunities also that this could lead you to, either individually for such citizens, but also for the country collectively.
Thank you. This is a very good question. So indeed, basically half of the population of Moldova, at least half, are already EU and NATO citizens. This means that they can travel freely in the EU, get jobs in the EU, and benefit from all the advantages. And in the beginning of the war, we actually saw a lot of people just take their passports and go. And that presents a whole set of challenges. At the same time, I'm optimistic. I tell everybody, look, we are a small country and half of the population has already integrated, whether we want it or not. So actually, we're a very good, success story and good case scenario. So invest in us and we will sort of be a success story of making it to the European Union quickly and hopefully not disbalancing it. Because in the Western Balkans, I had recently a conversation where, we need to bring the European Union in our countries and not our countries' problems into the European Union.
I know you in the back. And then I want a woman to ask a question too. So,
well, great.
Thank you. So building on that, you talked about how Moldova is hosting the largest per capita number of refugees at the moment. How is that affecting Moldova, both in terms of society, economy, and how does that refugee inflow affect your vision for the country and how you overcome these challenges?
So it's very interesting because this refugees case study is very different from any other refugee situation. So I've worked on refugee issues before and migration issues before. And I have seen some of the refugee camps in Jordan, for example, or, I have worked in the West Bank. So I know very well sort of the situation of Palestinian refugees in the Middle East and Syrian refugees and their plight. And here what we had is people who have had historically very close relations. We have in our society many, many households who have friends and family in Ukraine. And they actually, when you talk about refugees, they actually housed their second cousins, for a while. So there is a lot of interlinking. And also Moldovans are bilingual and they all speak Russian. So it's easy for people to integrate. We very quickly adopted rules that allowed the refugees to participate fully in our life, so in the social and economic life. So we gave them the right of work. So we had entire projects, for example, in the cabling industry, moved from Ukraine to Moldova. We also received support from our partners, not immediately, but over time, where we are covering the costs of healthcare for the Ukrainian refugees. We are covering the cost of education. And we also, this refugee population is largely women and children because men are not allowed to leave Ukraine. So what we have seen is that sometimes and this happened after the pandemic. What we've seen is sometimes there is a whole parallel world where just Ukraine moved to Moldova and it's probably not making a difference in either it's making a difference only in consumption because they work online for Ukrainian companies. Their children study online. By the way, I think Ukrainian teachers should receive monuments and medals after this because sometimes in these refugee situations, the online classes were the only normalcy that the children saw, and that was very important. So part of the population, it's like they're living in Ukraine, but they're just physically located in Moldova. Part of the population has integrated, are working, and if anything is helping Moldova because of the high deficit of people. And probably after they leave is when we're going to say, oh, actually, that contributed to growth and we didn't understand because we were on a negative trend. And then, part of it, like, for example, there are really interesting issues to research, really. For example, Moldova has had very high cumulative inflation, but the exchange rate is not affected. This could be because some of these Ukrainian refugees are coming with cash to Moldova and they are orders of magnitude different than in Moldova. So some of them may be actually very affluent refugees. And we've even seen, and for them, it's very comfortable to live in Moldova. We've seen even refugees, European countries to Moldova, because it's much more like home and it's closer to home, and there could be some circular migration. By the way, it's very interesting, I think, to study circular migration in light of many Moldovans holding Romanian passports, because, you know, you would think that sort of this keeps their link with Moldova and then allows them to return much easier because they know they can leave at any time. So it would be very interesting to disentangle some of that. But basically, we need policies to be able to attract people and at the same time sort of allow people to realize their potential wherever they are.
That's a great analytical work. Yeah, please.
Hi, Camilla Monkton. I'm from the UK Government and a Schornstein Fellow here, and I've worked closely with Anna Ravenko and Anastasia with you on strategic communications efforts. And so my question is around that, both coming about perceptions of the EU and all the investments, the complex policy topics you're talking about, this growth, but how is that felt and understood by the day-to-day citizen? Something that we had challenges with in the UK. And I grew up in Serbia, where I saw, you know, friends 10 years ago, really excited about EU accession, really supportive. And then I speak to a lot of them now and, you know, they've gone completely the other way. So I want to hear a bit more about how you see that being managed in Moldova.
That's a very difficult question. So again, everything depends on like, where are people getting their information from? Who do they trust? And how do we support or foster or affect this trust? So as I mentioned, like we tried to communicate throughout the crisis. You know, I had press conferences every week after the government meeting, but ultimately, you know, it might have been worse than better, because then you would have somebody like cut half a sentence and manipulate it, right? So it's a very difficult question. So on one hand, we have achieved some progress. So for example, support for the European Union went up. Support for NATO went up. This is very important in Moldova. But at the same time, you know, in the beginning of the war, people blamed Putin or Russia much more than now. Like they've come back to an equilibrium because they've watched the news, you know, there's fatigue, and then they sort of very easily fall back into beliefs that they have held previously. So we are trying different approaches. So we are, you know, working with different recipes. So we have created this new institution, which is just being formed to combat disinformation from a national security perspective. It's a very difficult topic. So we talk to civil society a lot. We believe in liberal democracy. We believe in, you know, the freedom of speech, and everybody's right to say what they feel. At the same time, we need to limit Russia's influence because it's actually a tool of war. So I think we're gonna also, yeah, I would say, watch this space. We're gonna be at the forefront of like using or creating a government institution that you know, will try to combat disinformation from a government perspective.
Well, this has been a terrific conversation. And unfortunately, one more question. Can I let one more question in? We'll take one more on the way back, and then we'll. So short question and short answer, and then because I know folks have commitments at 1.
No, I'm not sure this is going to be on.
We can hear you.
Okay. Just for the Zoom folks. I'm not sure this is going to be a short question and a short answer, so maybe we can cut it short. I think what I was really curious about is to hear, that Moldova too has, sort of developed some comparative advantage around medical education and pharmaceuticals. And I know, there are a couple of European Union countries that do that, Hungary and Latvia.
Belgium.
It's prohibitively hard for Germans and Italians, for example, to get to medical studies in their countries. And so they go to Latvia, they go to Hungary, and it's phenomenal universities. The problem that you see is that these countries sometimes don't really have the ecosystem to retain the talent, right? So you have talent inflows, but then, people especially within the European Union, because it's easy, they go back home. And by all means, Italy needs good doctors. This makes me really happy that people come back. But I was just wondering about your sort of like talent retention strategies too, and sort of the ecosystem you're creating or you're planning on creating around developing, maybe specialty experts in the field of, medicine, pharmaceuticals, veterinary services, etc. Thank you.
So to make it short, I will say that growth is the best strategy. I have not seen any better strategy to get out of poverty, improve your systems, improve governance, and just, become better at everything than ensuring economic growth and prosperity. If I am to go just a little bit into details for the IT industry, for example, we have created a special fiscal regime, and our IT specialists are staying in the country more than other areas. We have now IT is over 10% of GDP, and this creates an ecosystem, for the IT specialists. So now we have these like really cute cafes and co-working spaces, and it's nice design. And so in a way, what we need to do is sort of pursue our strategies for growth, and think if there is the cost benefit of providing sort of some special attraction, and then just letting sort of the ecosystem develop.
Well, Natalia, this has been fantastic. And you've talked about the many challenges Moldova faces. You've talked about the feeling of insecurity Moldovans have as they face these economic concerns, as they have war next door. You've also talked about the fact that reforms take time. And there's a question about how much time you have. You mentioned the local elections in early November. It is not looking like the governing party will do well. Those local elections matter in and of themselves, but they also matter for the presidential election next year, for the parliamentary elections in 2025. And I think probably everyone in this room hopes very much that Moldova will be in a place where you have a government in place that can see Moldova through on these reforms. And there are a lot of smart people in this room, including at the Growth Lab, who I know are committed to trying to help you think through what the best answers are for Moldova. And so I want everyone to join me not only in thanking Natalia, but also in wishing the very best for Moldova as it seeks to deepen its democracy and reach that Europe goal. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.